Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be welcoming you all to BSI's annual Net Zero Week and to kick off this exciting programme of events. As the national standards body representing the interests of UK industry on the global stage, BSI is at the forefront of helping accelerate change in the way we tackle our economic, social, and environmental challenges. Preventing the devastating impacts of climate change and achieving the target of reaching net zero by 2050 is the greatest challenge of our time. Our international team of experts work in every sector, sharing best practice, shaping standards, finding new ways to measure organisational progress towards net zero to ultimately help us all get to the heart of the issues surrounding our sustainability challenges. It is our mission to actively support you to achieve your sustainability goals, whether you're at the beginning of your sustainability journey or at a point where our support can help you progress to the next steps. Net Zero Week provides a unique platform to showcase the scope of the work being done across key sectors to meet global carbon emission targets. The series of engaging webinars taking place throughout the week will cover a range of key topics from sustainable finance to net zero in the food supply chain. And through these interactive sessions, we really aim to provide you with the expert knowledge and the latest industry updates to help you reduce carbon emissions and to help encourage you to join us in working towards the UK's ambitious net zero targets. To mark the start of this week, we're also very proud to share our Net Zero Barometer report for 2022. And it provides critical insights into how UK businesses are managing the transition to net zero. Now, based on the results from the survey of 1,000 UK senior decision makers and sustainability professionals, the report highlights that whilst almost half of the respondents are focused on business growth, only 20% are prioritising reducing carbon emissions. Given that time is of the essence, this highlights the extent of the challenge that we're facing. Now, that said, it's not all doom and gloom, and our annual survey also revealed a desire and an optimism actually from participants that the UK would achieve its net zero goal. And nearly 3/4 of those surveyed had already set targets to meet net zero. Post COP26, 78% of respondents were more convinced that reaching net zero targets is possible. For further insights into how industry leaders are paving the way for a sustainable future, the BSI Net Zero Barometer Report 2022 is available to access from the link in the Teams chat. Finally, I want to express my thanks to the organisers who've been working tirelessly to ensure the success of this year's Net Zero Week. Thank you to our inspiring speakers for giving up their time to share their insights with us. And thank you to all of you who have registered to participate in these sessions. It really is only through collaborative action that we can pave the way to a sustainable future. Thank you.
I'd like to tell you about a partnership we agreed last year with BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It came about because we had a new energy management standard due to launch, aimed at small and medium-sized organisations to help them reduce energy consumption and therefore reduce carbon emissions. Now, there's a lot that any organisation can do to support their journey to net zero, but reducing energy usage is a key part of it. I asked BEIS if they'd like to partner with us on the launch of this new standard, knowing the standard would match their aims to support SMEs on their journey to reaching net zero. They were really enthusiastic, so I asked them if they'd like to sponsor some copies so that they could be offered for free download. They agreed they'd sponsor 100,000 copies of the standard. We created a special version of the standard and a guide to using it, and both are available for free download from our website. So if you'd like a copy of our phased approach to energy management standard and a free guide, please visit the website. The link is in the chat, but you can just Google BSI 50005 Energy Management. We have a webinar coming soon, so keep an eye out for that and come along and ask our experts any questions you'd like an answer to. Please do share the link with your members, colleagues and friends so they can see how their organisations can benefit from the standard.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today on the Net Zero webinar. It's great to see so many of you here today. We are very excited about the programme we have for you today, and we have some great speakers lined up. Before we start, I briefly want to explain what Net Zero Week is and why we're holding this week of webinars. Net Zero Week is a week of webinars by each sector in the BSI Knowledge Solutions team, looking at how the net zero transition impacts their sector. This includes transport and mobility, ESG, healthcare, digital, the built environment, food, and obviously energy. Now, to put a little bit of context around this, I assume most of you are aware that in 2019, the UK government became the first in the world to pass legislation to reach net zero by 2050. But since then, an awful lot has happened since the original commitment was made. Many countries have followed the UK example, with well over 130 countries committing to net zero and 16 actually committing this into law. At the tail end of last year, we also had COP26, which increased the focus on the net zero agenda. We can debate the success of COP, but I do think it set the global direction of travel when it comes to the transition to net zero. We also had a global pandemic in COVID-19, which has impacted pretty much every sector of every economy. And there were two interesting elements for me during those 2 and a bit years. Firstly, in the midst of the pandemic, many of the largest producers of fossil fuels also committed to reaching net zero by 2050. Examples are Shell, BP, Total, and the world's largest coal mining company, Rio Tinto. Again, this highlighted for me the direction of travel. We also saw a drop in energy demand due to the global lockdowns, but as the global economy reopened in the aftermath of the pandemic, a massive surge in demand for energy started, and this drove a huge spike in demand for oil and gas, dramatically increasing the price of our energy. And finally, there is the awful situation in Ukraine with a terrible humanitarian cost. From an energy perspective, this has further exacerbated the rising cost of energy as Russian oil supplies are being restricted. As a result of all of these factors, European gas prices soared by more than 200% last year, and coal prices increased by more than 100%. This record rise in global energy prices has led to an increase in the cost of living crisis here in the UK, raising serious questions about the cost of the net zero transition, how to ensure a just transition, and it has also shifted the debate from focusing solely on decarbonisation to ensuring energy security. I firmly believe that the net zero agenda and the energy security agenda go hand in hand and are very much complementary to one another. But when we look at net zero, it is very clear that it is one of the biggest global socio-economic trends developing at the moment, and it will be for the next few decades. It is both one of the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities that humanity is looking to resolve. Energy and the energy transition is a cornerstone of this transition. There is so much going on this sector and in this sector, and we wanted to have a look at what the sector is doing to achieve net zero. Last year we had a lot of presentations, but this year we are keen to have a more informal style roundtable discussion. So we have invited speakers from different areas of the sector to discuss the net zero transition. I will briefly introduce each speaker now before they more formally introduce themselves and give their thoughts on net zero. So we have Laura Sanders, CBE, who's the non-executive director at SGN and the Energy Systems Catapult. She also chaired the Energy Systems Data Task Force and the Energy Digitisation Task Force on behalf of BEIS of German Innovate UK, and she's also the chair of BSI's Net Zero Strategic Advisory Group. We have Chris Corton, energy engineer for the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. He specialises in hydrogen and renewable energy technologies with a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Bath. We've got Emma Harrison, Head of Systems Integration at the Energy Systems Catapult, and she leads the Catapult Systems approach to net zero activities. Emma is responsible for a number of R&I projects looking at decarbonisation and energy and innovation in the UK and internationally. We also have Howard Porter, who's the CEO of BEMA, the British Electrotechnical and Allied Manufacturers Association. He's an expert on the government's Future Heat Panel and the Electric Vehicle Task Force. In addition to this, Howard was also the chair for the Strategic Advisory Group for the development of standards for demand-side response and the energy smart appliances work that we've been doing. And finally, we have Tanya Kumar, Head of Decarbonisation at CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, leading and managing CBI's policy team working across the energy and climate change landscape, including the energy transition, the built environment, and transport decarbonisation. But before I start the round table, I would like to provide a tiny bit of context around our role as the national standards body in supporting the energy transition. Do you mind moving to the introduction slide for me, Dimple? Let me start with a bit of housekeeping. Do you want to go to the previous slide, Dimple? I'll read that one out. So just to make you aware, this is a listen-only webinar. It is being recorded. If you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A function. We will hold a short Q&A function at the conclusion of the entire sort of introduction and the roundtable. If you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know in the Q&A and we'll look to support you. As mentioned, upon completion of a feedback survey, BSI will forward you the presentations and also the links to the various collateral. Also to make you aware that this is a CPD recognised webinar, so please request your certificate via the feedback survey following the webinar. Do you mind moving to the introduction slide, please? So I'm going to spend the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes to provide a little bit of perspective from BSI point of view, and then I'll stop talking and hand over to our guests. But just to put this into a bit of perspective, the 2020s will be the period of what the Telus Institute calls the Great Transition, and we talked already about this transition, and it will have geopolitical ramifications as those nations depending on fossil fuels will fundamentally have to change their economies away from fossil fuels, and those nations affected by climate change will have to adapt to the climate emergency. Interestingly, I recently came across some text where Bayes sort of mentioned that this decade is the crucial decade to deliver net zero by 2050, and I agree, because now is the time to sort of set everything on the roadmap to 2050. The scary part is that we're already a quarter into this decade. Interestingly, obviously, as a national standards body, we have an interest in standards, and when we look at COP26 at the tail end of last year, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his opening speech, mentioned standards specifically, and that they are needed to provide greater clarity in supporting organisations' efforts to reduce emissions. So, for us, the case for standards is quite strong. We believe that standards are needed to support the transition to a net zero future, making sure that from an energy perspective, new forms of energy generation and technologies are interoperable, safe, secure, and we believe there's a clear role for us there. We believe that standards can accelerate the adoption and mainstreaming of innovation, and we need unprecedented amounts of innovation to reach net zero by 2050. In particular, we believe that standards can help with mainstreaming and de-risking new markets. We also believe that consensus-based standards are required to provide credibility and rigour, particularly when it comes to green claims. Finally, we also believe that there is a bit of a USP. As the national standards body, we are part of ISO, the International Standards Organization, and that is active in 167 countries. And this has an unparalleled influence in the real economy and uniquely positioned to drive possible environmental outcomes. So we believe that the case for standards is quite strong. Next slide, please, Dimple. Oops. So we like to reframe the challenge into an opportunity, and the ending of the fossil fuel era can really be an opportunity. And what has been interesting for me when we looked at the net zero strategy, the UK government has been very clear that it wants to be a global leader in the technologies to tackle climate change. And so we, as BSI, have made sustainability and net zero core to our future strategy, and we want to help with that ambition, and are aware that standards form a component part of that wider vision. And so we are keen to take a leading role in the sustainability debate and use standards to support, accelerate, and hopefully the transition to net zero. Our aim really is to position standards where they help deliver policy outcomes and accelerate that transition to net zero. We have a convenership model, which I'm keen to sort of talk about in a bit, and we believe that can really help the implementation of policy outcome by bringing industry together. And finally, we want to use standards to support and mainstream innovation. Next slide, please. So bringing this back to energy specifically, when we look at energy and the energy transition, the energy transition is taking place and has started, and we're moving from the old model on the left hand side, where we've got a smallish number of central generation plants generating a lot of energy. We have a transmission company maintaining the motorways of energy and transmitting a lot of energy across the country, moving that to local areas where a distribution network operator maintains the A roads, takes the power down, pushes the power to the front door, and at the front door an energy supplier takes over. Now, this model is very much a top-down model. It looks at the peak demand and creates the energy for that. Now, this model is changing, and it's changing as we're talking, and this change has started already. But what we're doing is we're essentially bringing many different sources of energy on board, much more local generation, and we're creating much more of a system. And most of you are probably aware of the 3Ds. The energy system will become much more digitized, decentralized, and obviously decarbonized. And what this means is that in a few, if we look at the policy landscape, by 2030 there are no combustion engines on the road anymore, and we will any new vehicles will be electric vehicles, and they provide storage capacity, etc. And what this means is that this system of a relatively small number of generation plants will change to a system with many assets, all talking to one another. And we believe that in that transition, you need to have the systems and standards and protocols in place to be able to manage the system and to be able to talk to one another. Your car will be able to, or should be able to, talk to the grid, and meaning that when you come home at 5 o'clock, instead of going onto the grid, your home might be able to use the power on in your car, and therefore smoothing out the demand curve. Now, all of these areas require the standards and protocols, and that's really where we're trying to position BSI, to say, where are those standards needed, where are the gaps, and that's where we really try and make sure that we put the standards network and standards work that we're doing at value to support this transition. Next slide, please, Dimple. So what we ended up doing, we had a lot of our committees doing the standards work, but more and more we started to work on strategic programs of work that supported policy outcomes and policy ambitions. And there are just a sort of few examples here, but we've got the energy smart appliances, of which the strategic advisory group, how reported shared, but we work with BASE and what is now OZEF and industry to look at key standards for energy smart appliances, including EV charge points, looking at demand side response, and we created 2 standards past 1878 and 1879, allowing for smart appliances to talk to the grid and to sort of enable demand side response. We did the same thing with the Faraday Battery Challenge, where we brought industry together and developed 3 fast-track standards to look for needed standards for health, safety, and environmental considerations in battery manufacturing. We're doing a lot of work in hydrogen. We launched PAS 4444. We're supporting the hydrogen heating trials at the moment with a standards program. We did the same in sustainable finance and heat networks. And these are just some examples of strategic programs that we've recently completed. Next slide, please, Dimple. But what we really started to realize is that more and more with these strategic programs of work, we started to convene industry. Next slide, please. And this sort of became our convenership model. As the national standards body, we are separate to government and separate to industry. We're a profit for purpose, meaning that we haven't got any external shareholders who take any profits, and so any profits generated goes back into our purpose to support the UK with standardization needs. And because we're separate from government and industry, it sort of provided us with a unique position of being a neutral convener to bring wider stakeholders together to look at policy and wider societal issues. We've got the way we create standards. We have the infrastructure in place where we bring government, industry, regulators, community interest groups, and academia all together. And this sort of model became more sort of powerful. If we bring all of these players together, we can really look at where standards enable and accelerate. And even bringing everyone together, the answer might not be a standard, but at least we sort of look at that through that lens and bring everyone together. And particularly with these strategic programs of work, we ended up starting with a roadmap. So what is the ultimate outcome that we want? Where do we want to get to? Where are standards needed? And then once we have that roadmap, which is created by industry and by government, we then start to look globally, because there's no point in proliferating the standards landscape. If there is a standard that they're using somewhere else, then it's better to sort of adopt that standard rather than creating one. But if there isn't, then we know there is a gap. And the big thing is then, because we're bringing all the experts together, we're not the experts, we bring all the experts together, we then have agreement on the most pressing issues when it comes to fulfilling the sort of policy ambition. And if we then have that agreement, we can then co-create or coordinate a program of work that looks at these standards gaps and fulfill and produce those standards. But most importantly, we then know that the needs are established by industry. It's not BSI saying you need a standard, it's industry and government saying this is the policy outcome and here are the standards that we need. And the standards that we then create, we can generally are sure that they enable and accelerate that transition to that policy outcome, but in particular when it comes to sort of net zero. Even more importantly, the consensus process that we use with standards means that we then have consensus between industry, government and wider stakeholders. And I do highlight the wider stakeholders here because I think particularly community interest groups and the voice of the consumer is going to be much more important when we look at a just transition. So that is going to be key. But we have that consensus reached. And on the back of that, we have standards that are really for industry, by industry. And this then allows us to produce a standard that has an increased take-up, wider implementation, but it also will be coordinated much more with legislation and regulation rather than being created in isolation. The other thing with our international infrastructure into ISO, as mentioned previously, we can internationalize set standards, help with the sort of global leadership agenda as well, and really have a standards first approach here, led in the UK, that we then sort of push international. And we believe that this convenership model really means that we position standards where they accelerate, they are standards that are needed, the experts tell us where they are, and that they really help to accelerate the transition to net zero. I think that's it for me. I would like to introduce our first speaker. So we've got a number of speakers here. I was wondering if Laura, you can come on. I can see you've put your agenda on. If you can give a brief introduction and your thoughts on net zero and where we are at the moment.
Thank you so much, Seb, and thank you to the great team at BSI that's really sort of driving this net zero standards in many ways initiative globally. So thank you. I'm Laura Sands and also quite involved in the digitalization of the energy sector, and picking up on Seb's points about the 3Ds, digitalization will unlock a lot of these assets. At every single meeting one goes to, people talk about, on net zero, people talk about standards. And they're absolutely key to, in some ways, underpinning the net zero journey. And I sort of describe it as the essential plumbing that's required to ensure that we create the consistency, that we create the accountability, and to be frank, as Seb very rightly highlights, we create the transparency of exactly what, how the net zero journey is going and how we can drive industry and sectors towards net zero through standards and commonality. I mean, I'm very committed to the BSI's work and have been very honoured to be chair of the Net Zero Advisory Group, where we got some extraordinary experts who are looking to guide and shape, in some ways, supporting the BSI team to develop the best net zero standards. And I think that we should also be very sort of conscious of BSI's role internationally, because there's no point in us having standards in the UK and them not being rolled out internationally. But I do think that we're at the forefront of this. But to be frank, we've got a very long way to go and time is running out. So I think we need to really understand that net zero is not a sector by sector ambition. This is an economy-wide ambition, and BSI and all standards organisations have been very much sector by sector, working with consensus and working with those industries. So I think that we do need to have, in many ways, an economy-wide set of common principles that can be cascaded right way through all sectors, and then look at the key sectors, the foundation industries, in my view, that need to be the first on the list. So if I call them the carbon keys. If one thinks construction, huge consumer of carbon, it cannot decarbonize without steel, concrete, cement being decarbonized. So those are the key carbon keys that I think we need to really look at. Maybe later we'll talk about something that I'm interested in, and that is retrofitting a lot of old standards that really don't meet the net zero ambition. That's all from me at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Chris, I wondered if you can turn on your camera and give a brief introduction of your role at Bays and your sort of thoughts on the net zero transition.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Seb, and thank you everyone at BSI for having me here today. So my name is Chris Corton. I work at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, as it says on the slide there. I work in our energy engineering team. So what we do in our team is we have a whole range of functions, to be honest, but very broadly, you can categorize them into two. And the first one is our support to the policy teams. So we provide engineering technical advice to the policy teams. And specifically for myself, my focus is on hydrogen and energy storage. And I think it's important to say at this point that in that work we find standards can be extremely valuable in underpinning kind of development of policy. So as a good example of somewhere I've been working quite intensively over the last few months is with relation to the low carbon hydrogen standard. And that's just government guidance at this point. It's not a full rigorous standard, but certainly we have ambitions that we could take it that way in the future. And that's a document that underpins what we require for something to be designated low carbon hydrogen. So that's extremely valuable to government for us to be able to go forward and say, which projects do we want to fund? What does our future hydrogen economy look like? So in that way, we find standards extremely valuable. And then the other area, which is possibly where I spend more of my time working actually, is in the on the innovation side. And we support very closely the net zero innovation portfolio, which is the government's, Bays' £1 billion portfolio supporting innovation across a whole range of different themes in the net zero space. So we've got everything there. We've got hydrogen, we've got industry, we've got CCS, we've got energy storage, we've got nuclear, we've got renewables. You know, we've got the whole bag in there. Seb sort of stole a little bit of my spiel in his slides, which maybe I should have expected about some of the standards work we're doing there. But I just wanted to pull out maybe a couple of instances of work we've been doing recently, where development of standards in collaboration with BSI has been extremely useful to the kind of wider innovation work that's going on. And the first, as Seb mentioned, was the work on hydrogen for heating, and PAS 4444 has been extremely useful in kind of setting the baseline of what we require, technical requirements for domestic hydrogen appliances, and from there that will enable a whole rollout of future innovation around hydrogen village trials and everything else. And the other one was the work on smart energy and demand side response, specifically PAS 1878 and 1879, which again, extremely useful standards in kind of setting the technical baseline for that demand side response work. But I'm really excited to see that actually that's now going to be moved forward hand in hand with innovation work that we're funding. So under our flexibility innovation program, we're going to be launching very soon, hopefully, a competition which will be around supporting innovators to design technologies compliant with PAS 1878, and then that will also provide an opportunity for those innovators to actually test the PAS and how well it works, and look for options for improvement. So that's I think extremely exciting, and a really clear example of the way in which standards and innovation can work together, moving towards net zero. So I'll leave it there for now, but yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and that's a great example exactly where we want to place standards. Emma, can I ask you to turn on your camera and provide a brief introduction of what you do and your thoughts on the net zero debate?
Yes, thank you very much, Seb, and thank you, BSI, for organizing this really interesting and important event. I'm Emma Harrison. I work for Energy Systems Catapult. I lead systems integration team. And in Energy Systems Catapult, we work with innovators, particularly with SMEs, both those who are already active in energy sector, but also those who want to enter new world as Seb has described. We also worked with all levels of government, local, devolved governments and national governments. And we are looking in many different ways how we can not only achieve net zero, but achieve it in a such way that it supports economic benefits and societal benefits. As it was already said, challenge of achieving the 2050 net zero target is truly whole system, or as Laura said, truly economy. It will require change from all parts of the UK and all sectors of the economy and from all individuals. And as Sebastian said, it is arguably more complex challenge than anything we have ever done before. Because we must achieve net zero whilst we are ensuring economic and social benefits are maintained or enhanced, there are many varied and disparate interests, including parties and sectors who have never worked together before, who will now be required to do so. And there are very high levels of uncertainty in many aspects of this transition. This can be measured in terms of innovation and disruption, or in how people may choose to lead or follow. But most importantly, there is urgency. We have less than 30 years to achieve net zero, and we are currently not on track. So to succeed, we need adaptable, flexible plan to enable decision making. Next slide, please. To achieve that, we need whole system approach. And what we mean by whole system is that we need to join system from, for example, sources of energy to the consumer. We need to break silos between different parts of the energy system. But most importantly, we need to join up physical requirements of the system with policy, market, and digital arrangements. We also need to join national, regional, local, and individual levels. And whilst we are doing this, any solutions will have consequences for consumers, society, economy, environment, as well as technologies on which they are based. And we'll also have to fit as far as possible into wider societal goals. So we need to achieve a system that is not going to leave any sections of community behind. We need just transition. We need to keep downward pressure on the cost of decarbonization, because as we heard, we are facing unprecedented challenges in terms of cost of living. And we need to enable targets to be achieved with required urgency so that we can meet 2050 net zero target. Next slide, please. Net zero implicitly indicates that all systems must sum to zero emissions. And therefore, solution must be whole system optimization rather than component by component development. Previously, independent and separate systems will become highly integrated. For example, electricity, hydrogen, transport, building, industry, land use, etc. This will require integrated planning, development, operation, and regulation of different systems that have huge impact on value chains. And last but not least, significant digital infrastructure will be required to enable effective integration and interoperability to support necessary market transition. For example, decarbonization of heat, buildings, transport, industry needs tailored and integrated local solutions, and we need to find the right balance between respecting local differences, for example, infrastructure, demographics, politics, etc., and achieving enough standardization to allow local areas to collaborate and beneficial, or to replicate solutions and processes for developing these solutions. Next slide, please. It is important to remember that net zero cannot be achieved simply by throwing money at the problem and deploying traditional approaches. We have heard that energy system, for example, is going to change completely from the top-down centralized system to decentralized and digitalized system. So we need intelligent interventions drawing on digitalization to achieve net zero. Digitalization can enable or accelerate behavior change, but it is important to remember that complexity has to be kept as far as possible from the consumers. To achieve this, interoperability is key, and it must be vigorously pursued at all levels, including physical, data, and commercial. For this, there needs to be focus on pushing the standardization process and working with innovators to ensure that they do follow standards in delivering applications and solutions to the market. Standards have a very important role to play. They need to support innovation, accelerate uptake of existing technologies, and build trust in new and emerging technologies and services. They will help ensure interoperability and provide assurance to improve outcomes for consumers. But the challenge is to ensure that they address right issues at the right time, that they are developed at the right time. Thank you.
I was on mute there. Thank you very much, Emma. That was very much appreciated. Very interesting to see the whole systems approach, which you are very supportive of. Howard, wondering if you want to do a brief introduction and give your thoughts on the net zero developments.
Yes, thank you again. Thank you very much for organising such an event. Coming in forth in this, there's quite a lot of things already said that I would agree with, which is good. That we're not opposing views coming out here. So I'm the Chief Executive of BEMA, the Association for the Electrical Manufacturing Industry, and we regard for the electrical industry going forward key to the delivery of low carbon systems as we electrify large portions of the economy, particularly heat and transport. The role of standards to achieve some of those ends is absolutely vital. Now, I've got one or two slides which I'd like to show. I'll go quickly through them. Did you move on, please? Just go on to the next slide. Just one. So we sort of think that there are two areas where standards really are vital. One is, I suppose, the more obvious area, which are product design for net zero. So if you want to connect heat pumps to electric vehicle charging, to what's up in the grid, to ventilation systems, to many other areas of products, the products themselves need to have the relevant standards, and there's interoperability, and particularly integrating data systems into those areas. So that's the products and how they work together. But then there's a wider requirement for standards, and that's how the companies themselves decarbonize, and that is down to the scope 1, 2, and 3, working how we can help our members and other members reduce the carbon emissions of their manufacturing processes. And so it's a two sides that need to be looked at in the development of standards going forward. Next slide, please. I just want to look at, to back on one or two speakers, I think what Laura mentioned earlier, there's an awful lot happening. And we recently did some work looking at the investments needed within the grid in the UK. It's a major piece of work which you can access from the BEMA website, which I think gives a great insight as to what is needed investment. And the relevance of showing this today is that those investments are unlikely to come forward unless there's a relevant levels of standardization and standards that the investment community can look at and make an investment decision upon. So there's a great deal in this report, but you could argue there's as many questions comes out of it as it answers. but we certainly would say this is a real opportunity to start developing relevant standards to make the level of investment correct. Next slide, please. So just to say the specific roles of standards, for net zero, it is a framework for innovation. All companies will be innovating, they have to, and they will be encouraged to do so, to be sustainable, to be circular ready, to integrate between buildings and the grid, and the aforementioned 1878, 1879 that I chaired the development of. Very important that we integrate the different standards in a modern, flexible manner. But then looking at the industrial decarbonisation, it's how does everybody measure emissions in the same way, comparable, so that the credibility of claims, there is credibility. And I think I saw earlier, to avoid greenwashing. And then the very, very tricky area that's coming more and more to the fore now is comparing the embedded carbon within products. This is a very, very difficult area for many companies to work on because it's a traceability. So standards in those areas would really help going forward into the future. Final slide, please. I think also confirming what was said before, must be international. We are not alone in the world, and therefore for this to be globally relevant, it has to be a global standard. That in itself causes some difficulties in the slowness of development of standards, because the more people, the more countries that get involved, inevitably the amount of debate that has to go on comes. That's a challenge in itself, I think. And then identify the foundational elements that need to make a system work. Now, let's not try and standardize everything, but we need to identify where standards are absolutely needed and put all our effort into those areas. So that's probably the final message I would give, and I'm very happy to speak about it later. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Very much agree with everything you've sort of said there. Very much on, we don't have to standardise everything, but we need to find the key sort of areas. The other thing that was very fascinating for me there was when you talked about products and interoperability, how quickly you start to look from products to built environment to energy to manufacturing in a very simple sort of area. So very interesting. Tanya, I'm wondering if you can do a brief introduction and your thoughts, and we'll open up the round table.
Thank you very much, Seb, and thank you for having me here today. So I think I get the best position coming in last to reflect on some of the comments that everybody has made so far. But from a business perspective, just looking at the challenge at hand to decarbonise, I think most definitely what we've seen is a reframing of the challenge, as you said, Seb, in the last few years since the UK became one of the first developed economies over the globe to set a net zero target. We've seen a huge shift actually in the approach to decarbonisation, and particularly businesses now seeing decarbonisation and the shift to net zero as a catalyst to transform the economy, to gain higher productivity and investment, alongside actually contributing to the challenge of achieving 1.5 degrees. So I was particularly interested in Susan's remarks in the beginning of the video in terms of the net zero barometer report, and half of businesses there and respondents trying to balance growth and also emissions reduction at the same time. What we've seen out of summits like COP26 is actually this huge appetite now for the business community to lead by example, and standards play a huge part of that. And also, as many have noted on the call, the opportunity for UK business to be at the forefront of that, given the architecture that we have in place, having been the first and only economy to have the likes of the Committee on Climate Change and carbon budgets as well, which set our trajectory for achieving net zero by 2050. So what we see is now this huge shift and engagement really from businesses across all sectors of the economy. And I think something to focus on is the fact that this is definitely going to be a journey, and lots of different sectors are going to be at different stages of that journey to achieve net zero, looking at the pathway, the balanced pathway for 2030, 2040 and ultimately 2050. So interesting to see how standards will play a role for those different sectors. But like many have alluded to, this is definitely going to require a whole systems approach, because for the first time you're seeing the interactions between energy and transport, for instance, heating and transport and energy all coming together under one roof. And you're talking about huge changes not only in the way that we approach standards, but also in the governance of that system as well. And you've rightly pointed out, Seb, earlier on, that the events of the last few years have really put a sharp focus actually on our demand for energy, but also the resilience of our system in the process, but most notably the importance of consumers in this transition as well. And businesses are one of the most significant players in this game as a consumer. So for us at the CBI, we see businesses' role as the investors, the innovators and also the users of all of these changes in technologies that are coming through. And we've done a little bit of our own work looking at that business appetite that I've mentioned, joining coalitions like the UN's Race to Zero, which has required businesses to set targets and also prove how they will be reducing scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And transparency is really important in setting those standards across the business community. And over the coming years, we'll sort of see, as the data comes through, that sharing of best practice, which is going to be so critical actually to show delivery, because policy frameworks can only sort of set the trajectory. It is down to business to help actually demonstrate how that's going to work in practice. And then finally, of course, yes, the harrowing events of the last 6 months as well has put another sharp focus on the fact that we need to use energy better, but we also need to reduce our demand as well. And we actually need to invest more in our system to do that. So that's not only about sort of flexibility of energy supply. Some have also alluded to the digitalization of the system in the process, and also look at how it's going to support the onboarding of new technologies. So if we think about the deployment of hydrogen, for instance, across various parts of the system, development of heat pumps, if you look at transport, sustainable aviation fuels. So just to conclude, and excited to get on to a little bit of the discussion, underpinning all of this is going to have to be standards, and that's going to be critical as a signal to the business community as well, different facets of that, but also the financial system as well, in having confidence to actually invest in some of these pathways when a lot of the some of the outcomes are still unknown because a lot of these technologies haven't been proven. And absolutely, the UK, as someone who was there at COP26, is renowned for its ability to set standards. And we should take this window of opportunity to advance that. And that is also our contribution to the challenge of achieving 1.5 degrees across the globe. So I'll leave it there for now and look forward to discussing with the other panelists.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Tanya. Again, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Very clear on the whole systems view, and it's something that we keep coming back to. Wondering if everyone on the panel can turn their camera on. So we wanted to have a sort of informal discussion. So that means just jump in when you feel like it. We've got a few sort of topics to sort of kick things off, and so the first sort of question really is, when we look at net zero, it calls for nothing less than a complete sort of transformation of how we produce and consume energy. We talked about the global political consensus on reaching net zero is great, and it's a good cause for optimism, but the change required is significant, if not unprecedented. We talked a lot about the whole systems view, but what are some of the big challenges that we see in reaching net zero that we really need to overcome? And I thought, Chris, I'll come to you with that easy question, and then anyone sort of jump in, please.
I think it's a nice panel question actually, because we could probably all find a different answer to this one. There are so many different answers you could give. I was going to say something on the system side. I know that's been touched on already, but I think from what I've seen, we are moving, certainly in the innovation space and so on, we're moving from a situation where we're trying to work out what the component technologies will be in a future system, onto the next stage of understanding how to put them all together. And I think that's one of the big challenges that I'm interested in right now. And you can see that at all different scales as well, to be honest. So there's kind of obviously the kind of, maybe one of the most obvious examples is that whole energy system, ensuring that you have the energy when and where you need it, the storage and the flexibility and everything else. But actually, I find it's the same problem coming up in different areas. So again, taking it back to my my focus on hydrogen, we're getting a point now where your key hydrogen technologies are getting into quite a strong position, your electrolyzers and your end use technologies and so on. But we still don't have very much track record or understanding of how to put everything together to create one robust chain that will provide low carbon energy where it's needed. And so that's something where we're focusing more of our innovation programs, is that kind of whole system deployment. And then just to extend that one a little bit more on the system thing, there's clearly an international aspect to that as well, and something that can value much more focus, I think, is integrating internationally, and that will enable flexibility, and also for example, the UK or any country to be able to exploit, maybe exploit's a bad word, but make the best use of renewable resources wherever they may be on the globe. And so it's somewhere I'm very interested is kind of the opportunities for transporting energy globally to help decarbonize. So I'll leave it there for now, but lots of answers to that question.
Could I add to that actually, Chris, because I think you're absolutely right. But one of the other important things about having some global standards that sort of underpins net zero is it actually will create cost reductions, because we won't end up having to manufacture all sorts of different components in different ways, and it will really sort of drive that productivity through. But I think also Chris's point is very important around, and also Tanya's, about the proliferation of actors in the sector. So today we've got about 400 people who run the energy sector, and they all know each other's golf handicap. Yeah. And we are moving to 100 million actions and assets on a system, if you think every EV car can do two things. So how are we going to unlock that? And I think everybody's made the point, but I'll just make it yet again, and that is that the standards that we need for net zero sit in many ways not in each of these sectors. And as Tanya rightly said, energy and transport is becoming one thing. It sits between them. And that's why standards are going to be incredibly important. They're also going to be quite challenging, because you will have people from the energy sector sitting next door to somebody from the automotive sector. Interaction. So just a few challenges for BSI in terms of diplomacy, in terms of convening power, to actually start to drive those silos in some ways, and look at blended solutions rather than silo standards.
If I can maybe come on, Laura, I agree, and perhaps I'm being responsible for one of those silos, or perhaps multiple silos within the silo I look after, is that I think there is a definite challenge to bring those silos together. And I would maybe concentrate on the other challenge, which is the one I mentioned in my piece, is the speed. How can we make the development of what are going to be more complex standard systems in a more rapid fashion? Now, I'd be delighted to say I've got a solution. I don't. But I think it will be, something that we could take away from this event and actually put some brain power into this. Because I know many people who've been involved in standards for years and years. Very good people, expert in the areas they get involved in, but try to get them to change fundamentally and do things quicker is very challenging, for good reason, because they want to make sure that standards are competent, are supported broadly by industry or international. So there's also some good reasons why the systems we have in place do take some time. But I don't think we can wait for 20 times a 3-year development of a standard because by which time we've run out of time. So I think, I suppose, a plea and a suggestion to Seb, perhaps, and his wider team, is perhaps we can have a big brainstorm about how we actually get on with this.
I think that's a really interesting point, Howard. And when we reflect on the last few years, we've had to develop a lot of standards very quickly in response to the pandemic. So what we've seen is this sort of sense of urgency from the business community to also approach achieving net zero in a similar way, thinking about some of those big systemic changes that have to take place this decade. The transition to electric vehicles, as you'll know very well, Howard, that is set to be one of the key transitions that have to take place for us to meet that new revised NDC that the CCC have also said, that we need to achieve. But how do we actually achieve that at speed, and what are the levers that we can work with the business community but also government to accelerate that transition? It requires a different approach and agility to sort of standard setting and policy setting as well, and a willingness to revise something quite quickly if it's not working, or looking at the impact analysis of something quite fast. And just to build upon the other bit, I liked, Laura, your point around blended solutions is definitely something that we need, and bringing those minds together across different sectors, because the solutions, like Chris mentions on hydrogen, it's going to have applications for different sectors. So it's requiring people to come out of those silos. A prime example of that is industrial decarbonisation, for instance. It's going to require businesses in clusters sort of coming together, and where somebody has an output, it can be utilised as someone else's input to help decarbonise. But that reframing of thinking is actually quite urgently required, because we're not that far away from 2030. When we talk to businesses, they've already in their business plans have those investments planned for 2030 today. So those pathways become, even more urgent as a result.
Well, that is very interesting, Tanya, and particularly when you mention sort of the EV rollout in 2030, and I mentioned at the start, we're already a quarter into this. Like, some of this transition will happen at speed, and it's so fast. We think we're 2.5 years into this decade. I'd be very interested. I was going to ask this a lot later, but seeing as we sort of got on there now, how do we ensure that BSI and other standards really support the needs of policy setters and accelerate the transition to net zero? I think there's an interesting element there that you mentioned there on speed, Howard. You mentioned sort of one thing in your presentation was very much on the idea of, you sort of recognise that the standard system moves at a certain pace because there's a consensus element required, right? And you can't sort of just do it. Yet on the other hand, we're trying to sort of balance speed. And one of the ways that we have done that is, with the Energy Smart Appliances programme, what we do is we look globally, create a fast track standards here in the UK, and then look to internationalise that, which is one sort of option. But again, even that is not, extremely fast, right? So, and it is something that is sort of, it is something for me that I'm sort of trying to think about. And then obviously there is this whole infrastructure in place, and there's the due diligence. How do you think we ensure that standards really support that policy outcomes, and how can we speed that up? I don't know if anyone has any sort of thoughts on that. Did you have any thoughts on that, Howard? You've been extremely close to some of the standards work that we've been doing.
Probably have too many thoughts for this seminar, but I think it is. It maybe taking what Tanya said, and taking some exemplars from what happened in the pandemic, because there were some mistakes made. It wasn't all good news, but there was an awful lot of quick change. Now, how one can use that sort of exemplar within this broader area of primarily energy-based standardization, I think that if there is a seniority game within government, within industrial leaders, within BSI, within CBI, within the Catapult, to actually bring together those serious players and have that serious conversation, that standards, and I hate to say this with you involved, Seb, sometimes as you go up the tree, perhaps aren't deemed as being central to our future, but we have to make sure that there is that brought up and actually had that high level discussion. I mean, Laura, your background may help us in this area as to how to get that level of seniority that if there is a plan to move forward at pace, it has the support, both politically, industrially, and ultimately the consumers trust that speed, is perhaps one idea how to take this forward.
Could
If I can go on, Laura.
Emma, go.
I just wanted to add, I absolutely agree with you that it is not always perceived as very exciting or very worthwhile of executive discussions. But one thing that probably could help is if we break down some silos between technology standardization and service standardization. Because to support policy and to support decision making, if we can bring these two things together, because we are moving into a world where consumer protection, security, safety, and so on are becoming much more important. And I think if you link these two things together, it will probably become more interesting and more important to the C-suite rather than purely technology standards.
I totally agree with you, Emma, and I think the point that you and also Tanya talked about was sort of consumer trust, and that is going to be a very, very important part. But I would say that I think, and this picks a bit up on what Tanya was saying as well, is put together standards and realize that they have to be flexible. The idea that we've got things that are written in stone for 30 years is really not going to be in many ways adaptive or agile enough. But on one hand, I'm looking for flexibility. On the other hand, and I hope our advisory board will sort of request this from BSI, we need some very, very clear economy-wide carbon standards, right, that actually fit into every standard. So they're like, sort of and so of course around carbon transparency and reporting, around that all standards should be delivering net zero, not embedding old-fashioned or carbon-intensive processes. And in some ways, if you had your guidebook, your set of principles that never allowed a standard to in many ways, sort of be different from that sort of core set of principles, then you actually hold the ring somewhat more than being buffeted. I know you're not buffeted around, but standards are developed by incumbents. And we have to be really, really clear that there is a future non-incumbent objective for standards, and that is net zero and decarbonisation. And that is not negotiable, because otherwise you will end up with people slowing systems down, and you can even set standards that have timeframes to them. So you don't need to set a time, that today this has to happen. But in that standard, there needs to be accountability on what needs to happen going forward. Otherwise, you'll end up, in many ways, revisiting all these standards. I have one other thing which I really wanted to raise, and I know that this is sort of boring because we're talking now about all these exciting standards and how we're going to create blended projects and services, etc. I actually think the whole standards world needs to do a lot of housekeeping. And that housekeeping is going through old standards that have got massive carbon embedded within them, right? There is, I would actually set up a unit that just goes through them. So we've got our quality, our calorific value of gas was designed to support North Sea gas. Well, now we import most of our gas, and it ends up being reinforced, costing us more with more calories in it. We've got steel. Our building standards have got more steel than is needed because British Steel in the 1970s wanted us to have more steel in our building standards. And today we import the steel from China. So can we also do a bit of housekeeping and clean up those very old-fashioned standards too?
I think that's a really powerful point, Laura, on the transparency and the data that comes with this as well. With this huge movement towards businesses setting net zero targets, there's a great window of opportunity where everybody is going through this challenge together, and as a CBI harnessing that intelligence sharing, the challenge that everybody is facing, there will be a unique opportunity to do that, but not only domestically but internationally as well, because everybody is faced with this huge challenge. No one has done anything like this before, and what we see is that businesses are going to outlast a lot of political cycles as well, so they will see the ramifications of it. It is very live for a lot of businesses that are based in different quarters internationally. So I think, Laura, on that point, now that is the power of things like net zero targets, because people do need to be transparent in their yearly reporting now, sustainability reporting, but also to attract private finance. If we're looking at some of the standards, the huge swathe of standards actually coming in their community, they are having to report. But consistency is going to be so important across sectors, that one count of carbon is exactly the same for construction as you are seeing it, say, aviation, for instance, and that compatibility and comparability is going to be so crucial. I don't think there's the famous word, there's no silver bullet to it, but it does require this sort of convenership model, Seb, that you speak of, that sectors have to come together and be quite open with, this is how we are accounting for it, how are you doing it? Because everybody is going to now fall in one another's sort of scope 1 to 3 emissions as well.
A lot of very interesting thought. We obviously have the London Declaration, where we, with ISO, where we review standards. But I like the idea of setting up a unit, Laura, and actually going through that. Seems very interesting. Chris, I saw Chris and Howard. I saw both of you nodding quite vigorously there. So some body language. I don't know if you guys had anything to add to this at all.
Not too much to add. Maybe it's almost an obvious point, but I think that was very interesting, very good case that Laura is making there. And you have to appreciate how different, if you consider how far we've come in the last 28 years, and therefore how far we'll change between now and 2050. You do have to appreciate the need to be dynamic and be flexible with things like standardization. So yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, no, I think it's essential to do what Laura is suggesting. I don't underestimate the challenges from the incumbents, because there will be challenges, because the commercial reality of life will click in very quickly. But I think maybe that's the test. Tanya, I think, quite correctly says that all companies are now having to report on their carbon emissions, quite rightly, and some with enthusiasm, some with less enthusiasm. But ultimately, we've got to force the issue and see what comes out, I think, because otherwise, if we just carry on in the same track, in the same way of doing it, it will not change. It will not change. Therefore, some disruption of the system may be unpopular, but I think it has to be seen to deliver that long-term future and prosperity. And that's why I think I come back to my earlier point, if this was supported by a sort of a higher level people, organizations, whatever, coming together and actually saying this is really what we ought to do, I do think it will get more support. But we need that disruptive way of doing things.
Interesting. I'd like to slightly change tack now. I've got all of that written down, so I've got my task list to take back into BSI. Tanya, and a number of interesting things you mentioned there. One of the things that I sort of noted down, which I thought was quite interesting, businesses outlast the political cycle. I thought that was an interesting sort of statement. Obviously, net zero and the net zero agenda obviously has a big sort of political driver, and obviously at the moment we you know, there's a lot of inflation going on. We have the cost of living crisis that is unfolding, and this will have a big impact on the net zero narrative and perception. Is there anything that we can do to ensure a just transition? And obviously, you know, the big question, so we'll look at EV transport that you mentioned, Tanya. The question is, those least able to afford an electric vehicle will probably pay most in you know, through energy bills and that kind of thing, and will they therefore be subsidising those that can afford other things? So how do we ensure, you know, a just transition when we sort of have a, you know, cost of living crisis unfolding? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that sort of easy question. You know, there don't seem to be any easy questions here, but I am aware that the narrative will change on net zero, and I'm aware that consumers rightly will have some concerns about the cost that this puts on their energy bills when they will rise inevitably. So I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on that to kick off that discussion point.
Yes, definitely, and it is a very apt point when we think about the cost of living crisis. The way to look at it is obviously the long-term reduction in bills from investments in the net zero transition. So the most notable one is, you know, our long-term investments in offshore wind, how that is paying off for the transition of the energy system now, and you can't foresee the shocks that might come down the system further down the track. A lot of these changes we were going to be implementing on the back of having legislated for a net zero target. But a huge focus for us, if you take the current energy crisis, is actually harnessing, you know, the ability of the able to pay market to make some of these changes. So in particular, you know, the transition for EVs, it's been incredible to see that during the pandemic, we've seen a huge rise in those, you know, from savings that were made, investing in electric vehicles and increasing that demand for EV charging infrastructure. So finally, we saw that charging infrastructure strategy coming out from the government, which has been long awaited. So we're starting to get there on the tipping point, but even still, there is a long way to go for us. And that's where the policy signals become increasingly important. The same with energy efficiency. However, we would argue there is still a huge gap to be filled there. And I can't remember, I think, Laura, you might have mentioned, and we'll delve into it, you know, the built environment and the role of standards there, retrofitting the standards for the built environment, that is a huge task, most notably because the built environment is now becoming the focal point for that intersection between the energy system and transport. And it never knew that would, you know, that would be the case. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have thought about that. We're talking about completely revamping non-domestic and domestic, you know, homes and buildings, but there is a gap to be filled there on energy efficiency. And we think, you know, now when you're seeing bills rising, there's been a huge appetite for people to insulate better, to think about considering, you know, how do we deploy heat pumps as well. But still, that does require support from government to help make those markets. So coming back to Chris's point, some of the, you know, majority of these technologies are still new. Even for electric vehicles, we haven't had people driving those electric vehicles for, say, a 10-year period as yet. So the resale value of battery technology, for instance, is still unknown. Even for the likes of Tesla, for instance, they don't know what that secondary market is going to be. So it comes back to my initial point around, you know, the engagement with consumers and the shift in behavioural change absolutely is going to be critical and fundamental, and that's been missing to date. And businesses actually sit at the nexus of that, in between sort of, you know, policymakers, consumers, and business, to help those shifts really in consumer behaviour. So looking at, you know, your element of the just transition as well, there's a huge growth opportunity across the country as well. So the jobs argument comes into play because we're talking about industries transitioning. So how do you encourage those local communities to be part of that transition as well, and see how that's going to impact lives and livelihoods? So we're already seeing that with businesses in Yorkshire and Humber, for instance, that have completely pivoted themselves towards the net zero transition. Same with the Northeast, for instance, with a lot of the investments in gigafactories as well. But if you start looking at the geography of the UK, I think what we've all seen in the last few years is suddenly there is expertise across the entire of the UK in various different technologies as well. So that is a huge opportunity if you're looking at long-term, job prosperity and growth, and something that's been on the front of people's minds, particularly during the pandemic. A lot of people wouldn't have thought that certain jobs would, if you worked in close proximity, that you wouldn't be able to go to work, for instance. So it has really sort of sharpened the focus. And lastly, a recent poll just over the weekend from Onward, for instance, just showed how net zero was still a key focus and priority for the electorate. So I think people seeing the impacts of climate change as well, and something that they can relate to when it comes to public policy across every strata of people across the UK, has been really, important to see that. But we've got to make sure that everybody feels invested and that they have a voice in this transition as well, and that it's, the best technologies for those different individuals. So it's a very exciting time, but agreed, it has to be managed, and that's where government can help step in to help support some of those changes.
And if I may add, when we talk about just transition, most people think just in terms of individuals. And of course, it is an important element, and we have to make sure that people, all sections of community and people in all circumstances can participate in this in a fair and just way. But there is just transition also from the local or area point of view. And we in Catapult strongly believe that a lot of these things need to be delivered in a local context. So when we are talking about EV charging infrastructure, for example, we have to recognize that needs of people living in Cornwall villages are very different from central London and very different from Scottish Highlands. So all big decisions around infrastructure and around market arrangements and so on do have to consider not only fairness at individual level, but fairness between different communities and different regions.
I totally agree, Emma, and also Tanya, but your point about local, so I chaired with Caroline Lucas and Hilary Benn the IPPR Commission on a just transition, and some of the key elements came through exactly as Tanya says. There is absolute support and in some ways demand from the public for action on climate, right? So there is absolutely no lack of appetite for it. What they're absolutely, though, keen on ensuring is that government does that in a fair way, that the burdens don't hit those who have the least ability to manage them. And to be frank, I mean, my whole sort of the work that I've been doing called Recosting Energy actually states that if you look at the system as it will be not so far in advance, actually consumers can get the benefit of whole system value. Unfortunately, currently, they only get the value of a commodity variation. Right? But if you gave them the whole system value, then you would start to put price pressure on the whole system going down, but also you would reward consumers, you would be able to monetize and release things like EV cars at a lower price, heat pumps, etc. And Chris, I'm going to ask you to go back to BEIS and talk to your fabulous modelling team, who did, we think, in the first time in the world, they compared demand and supply equally across whole system costs. And what it shows is that actually demand side, whether it be Tanya's businesses or whether it be, Mr. Smith down the road, they actually can add value and reduce whole system costs. And one just little point, and I don't know how this works into your standards proposition, but let's also understand when you're looking at standards is that each of these components of our energy system will have multi-functions. And so a car is not a car is an energy storage system, an exporter of energy. It is also a resilience tool. And what I think the ESO says is by 2035, the amount of EVs on the system will equate to 3 nuclear power stations. and they must not be cut out of either the market or the opportunity of behaving and performing in that way.
I think there's something very interesting that comes from all the speakers in the last 10 minutes or so, and I've just been thinking, you're looking again where standards will play in a wider context perhaps is within buildings, and the colleagues in Lending Up and Build, whatever it's called now, and the department about building regulations. And building regulations and standards always seem to be spoken in different contexts. And the point Laurie just made about the EVs and the role they play, it's very difficult in a building regulation stroke standards to include that. You can't account for the energy tariff you have. If you've got if a consumer chooses a zero carbon energy tariff, you can't count that. Not allowed. So there are some very old-fashioned ways of counting energy, counting carbon in the buildings context. And I would probably say that within the networks area and delivering energy is probably more advanced in its thinking than in the buildings area. And so perhaps that's an area, again, Chris, to think about. And your comment, I'm sure it's not all down to you, mate, I'm sure, but and others, is how do we bring forward the way of assessing carbon, assessing energy within the buildings area, particularly as, you know, the estimate for refurbishing is what, 500 billion pounds? Now, if we're going to get any near that level of investment, there needs to be an awful lot more clarity on how all this is measured. And if we want the consumers to contribute some of that investment as well.
Which also builds on the quality of retrofits, and how do you even provide either quality assurance or training, accreditation, and so on, because people would feel much more confident about spending money either personally or as an investment if you can actually have some confidence that it is going to provide benefits.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point there. How to assess carbon is quite good. So it's good to see, Chris, that I'm not the only one that's getting a task list from the panel. And I thought, Tanya, you made such an interesting point as well, which I'm sort of slightly obsessed about. It's the sort of resale value of EVs, and Laura mentioned that they can go as you know, they can work as storage units of energy, which is such an interesting sort of element, because there is an assumption here that, okay, that it can deliver, you know, 3 nuclear power points, but if you use storage, because at the moment we use cars and we use mileage as a proxy for, you know, how worn the car is. How do we do that if we use it as a storage capacity, and what does that mean for the resale value? And there's some assumptions on that, you know, we will use it for that. So it's a very interesting element. We've got 7 minutes left, and then I want to ask some of the panel questions for the next sort of 10 minutes. I know you have to go at 3, Laura. So I just wanted to briefly talk about sort of innovation, and you know, net zero requires us to get, you know, unprecedented levels of innovation. What does the panel see the role of innovation is in net zero outcomes? How can we support and foster innovation, and what is the role of standards? You know, well, I've got a view, and I'm keen to get everyone's view on that. I was going to go to you, Emma, but seeing as Laura's going to shoot off in 6 minutes, I'll switch to Laura and then go over to you if that's okay. Did you have any thoughts on that at all, Laura?
Well, I wonder, coming back down to the principles on how standards should or could be developed, that you would always include some innovators, not just incumbents, in how you develop standards. So this isn't just the old world speaking. I would also, to be frank, include some consumers, and whether that be commercial consumers, Tanya's members, or whether that be people, you know, citizen consumers, depending on what you're talking about. So I think you have an opportunity to broaden the views that you're taking on board as key components of, because you're designing the standards for the future. So I would say that that will be helpful with innovation. You do have to, though, ensure that maybe your standards have this future flexibility built into them, where there are pivot points, where there are review points, but where even things that seem far-fetched today actually are allowed to be incorporated, so that these are not static standards. I do, though, think consistency around the carbon reporting, the visibility, and those sorts of issues need to be common and absolutely static, embedded. But then on top of that, you can then have greater flexibility. But as we all know, things that are set today are not going to be fit for a revolution. That's what we're going through. And so you need that sort of dynamic, which I think Chris articulated extremely well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Emma, obviously, so I was going to come to you, the Energy Systems Council Board, leading very much on the future of sort of innovation and working very closely with innovators. Did you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. First of all, it is really important what both you and Tanya have said about deciding what needs to be standardized, because there is danger of trying to standardize everything, and with slow timescales and everything else, it becomes a barrier. Also, innovators, especially SMEs, at early stages of their development, don't see this always as something either very important or certainly not as an enabler. So what I think is really important to have this baseline of really important things that need to be standardized. So carbon accounting being one, but also big binary choice decisions, if you wish. So things that are going to provide a spine for any future development, so that they can provide certainty to enable development of certain solutions, but to raise financing, but also to try and build interoperability from the very beginning by defining, to start with requirements they need to meet, and then, as Laura says, whatever emerges, even things that we cannot imagine today, they have some skeleton to fall back to make sure that they can fit in the system. And then the other important thing is to consider this from end to end of life cycle point of view, because there is no point developing only technology. You need to know what business model is going to look like, how will consumer protection work, how will we operate and dispose of these things, what resale value or kind of recycling or reuse of these things may be. And I think that you have to approach standardization in a context of critical points and critical things that are needed at some time, and how you can provide enabling framework of standards rather than trying to micromanage and standardize every single thing at kind of day one.
No, exactly. Thank you very much for that. I think it's key to say, you know, I agree. What needs standardised? Where do we come in? Also, where do we not come in? Right. So, what is emerging? Where do we not need to standardise? It's probably just as key as sort of standardisation.
Yeah, I'm thinking. Yeah, I think this is linked into a number of areas we've already covered in, and it is. I think it was certainly worth exploring if there was the development of generic standards on performance, carbon performance of products and systems. If those were strengthened, would there be sufficient standards that underneath innovators could innovate on different solutions, but all have to report and have to be seen under the same performance criteria? And that there's some elements of that been in existence for a while, but I don't think it's been taken that seriously as to if we can do that and therefore be able to say to innovators, look, go off and innovate. You don't have to demonstrate your standards straight away, as long as your solution meets these overall criteria.
Yeah. No, that's such a good...
and doesn't kill people, of course, you know.
Yes, but I think that's such a good point, because I think that's really where standards and regulation could work together, right? To say this is how you demonstrate compliance with consumer protection. Because I mean, it's interesting in the energy supply space, you've had a lot of energy supplies having to put safeguards in place for vulnerable customers, yet most of the energy switching is driven by consumer comparison websites, and they're not regulated, right? Actually, a standard could fit in that space to say this is how you demonstrate consumer protection, this is what your responsibilities are as a consumer website. And you know, that's just one element where you think actually industry is sometimes moving faster than regulation can keep up. Is there a grey area for standards to support outcomes-based regulation, if you like? I was going to go on to the questions, but I could see you wanted to come in there, Tanya.
No, I think I was just about to say that I think you're spot on there in terms of that grey area, because businesses, in terms of encouraging innovation, and Laura was talking about, and Howard as well, you need a disruptive mindset as well. And absolutely for these grand challenges, it's disruptive behaviour that needs to be incentivized, but also you need to give the market, both consumers, people and businesses, confidence, and that's where standards can step in to give the confidence of, actually, I'm going to invest in this because we do know that the government is rigorously putting a set of principles behind this as well. But also, when I talk internationally, the UK's role of standards is held to high regard, actually, that it's a place that can demonstrate in a sort of closed system how standards can work. And I think that's something that we as a UK community don't talk about enough, actually, because these challenges for everyone, they're going to have to act pretty quickly as well. But we have the benefit of being smaller in geographical space, as I alluded to before, that we can actually export these standards and our expertise, because everywhere else they're grappling with much larger challenges. So it's definitely an area to help sort of promote UK export standards, really.
Yes, no, that sounds really good. Yeah, no, thanks. That's a really good sort of view. I was going to go on to question and answers, but Chris, in your opening sort of speech, you mentioned innovation. So not quite sure if you want to add your 2 pence before I move on to the questions from the audience.
To be honest, that was very comprehensive. I'm not sure I have anything to add. I mean, I think because I raised this at the beginning, which is why I'm reluctant to raise it again. But this question about interactions between standards and innovation is a good one, and I do think this model that we've got in this upcoming competition under the Flexibility Innovation Programme will be really really interesting to see how it plans out. Where we will ask innovators to develop technologies compliant with PAS 1878. And then there will be an opportunity both for those innovators to have that kind of shared space and that consensus in order to develop technologies. But meanwhile, it's an opportunity to kind of review the effectiveness of the standard. I think that seems a great solution to me, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where that pans out. And hopefully, it'll be a model that can be repeated in the future.
Yes, and I think that's a very exciting thing to say. Actually, this is an area of innovation. This is the standard. Now, iterate back. Yeah. And then actually, what are the findings, and then how do we need to iterate the standards so it's sort of up to scratch. I want to spend the next 5-10 minutes and then we'll sort of round off, but just to take a few questions from the audience. Some questions have been filtered to me. So one here is, on the back of Howard's credible claims comment, how do you see businesses proving that they meet these standards in a way that can be scaled globally? Would it be a good way to raise with the whole panel at the certification dimension? Okay, so you talked about credible claims. How can people demonstrate and verify the claims, and is there a certification angle there, Howard?
Well, I'd be shot if I were to encourage more certification costs, because that's not what we always want to say. But I think certification of some, there has to be some level of that. But as I said, if there is, and there is a developing, I think this is developing a valid level of standards that companies can look at in terms of their performance as companies. And as I mentioned, particularly embedded carbon and other areas. I think as soon as we can work to develop those standards, inevitably there has to be some level of compliance and some money, I'm sure, involved to make sure that one demonstrates compliance to those standards, because otherwise it's difficult for them to make an impact. There has to be some level of compliance. I think that's what the questioner was asking for. I hope I've answered that appropriately.
Yep, no, and I think, you know, the honest answer is that some of these standards will need, you know, obviously verification. Also have, you know, particularly in green claims, you know, the verification element is probably going to be sort of very important.
And also there may be some legal aspects as well, because again, if there's accusations of greenwashing, which I'm sure there will be in the future, there will be some, you know, legal requirements to have that compliance. And if somebody accuses a company of greenwashing, you've got a viable, well, a comeback that's legally tied.
Yes, and I think the well, this is recorded, but I believe the Competition Markets Authority is looking into green claims and the validity of that. So again, it seems to sort of fit in there. And again, I think that's where standards play in that role of credibility. I think they're particularly investigating green claims that are being made that haven't got any validity behind them, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so final question here. Where did the panel feel that energy efficiency technology fits into this area? Surely with such a change in technology for energy production, we should look at minimizing the load on the system. I've got a particular view on that. I can see you nod your head vigorously there, Chris. I presume you sort of agree with the focus on energy efficiency.
I mean, absolutely. I think it's really important. I think we probably need to do more in that area, to be honest. I think it's easy to focus on the supply side first, because that's where you can kind of see the big wins and you get to build the great big wind turbines and everything else. But we absolutely need to be focusing on energy efficiency, and that completely ties in with the energy cost argument as well, because if we can drive down energy demand, then we drive down costs for consumers as well. So yeah, fully on board with that.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Absolutely. And it links into what I said about building regulations, buildings, the assessment criteria. Energy efficiency is always left out. It's a bit too difficult because it involves 20 million investments, 20 million plus. And again, in my view, that area is due for some big change to make sure that everyone says you've got to improve the quality of the buildings out there to make sure that we reduce the actual energy use before we have to invest in even more wind turbines or nuclear power plants. But it is always left off because politically it's very difficult, which is why I think industry standards can be, again, if there was this big review of how we take things forward, that's almost number one. How can the industry and standards community work together to come out with some new ways of measuring this to make it easier to happen?
And it is really important to remember that as good as useful it is on its own, it has so many implications on other things. So decarbonizing heat becomes significantly easier challenge if we have energy efficiency, but also it can provide real difference in health and well-being and comfort to vulnerable communities and to people and so on. It can improve housing stock overall, and so it is not only good in its own right, it is so important from other point of view.
Couldn't agree more. And Howard, picking up on your points, and Emma from before, the localized element of the heat challenge and the built environment is also going to be pivotal as part of this. So it's utilizing local authorities, metro mayors, you know, regional bodies as well, to help adopt those standards, Zeb, and that education piece, I think, around sort of standards as an enabler. Because if we're just looking at the wider context, you know, your previous question, Zeb, on the cost of living crisis, we're also faced with an environment where costs are high across the piece. It's not just energy. We're reflecting on coming out of the pandemic. The government has spent record amounts on some flagship policies. So we also need to look at ways that, you know, there are different tools in our armory that might be able to help sort of incentivize change. That won't cost anything in addition, but can help signal and create that behaviour change in the market. And standards for heat and energy efficiency, which is now the biggest challenge across the whole decarbonisation space, that's going to be key. And we should also learn something that we haven't talked about is actually, where have standards worked well? Sometimes we are very quick to criticise, you know, we need to do this and we need to do that. Learning from best practice of where we have been able to leverage standards and look at what the recipe of that was, and can you replicate that? But then it goes back to sort of Howard and Laura's points on, it has to be iterative in that approach, but we don't need to sort of rewrite in some elements the book on standards. It's about sort of leveraging what we have done well and applying it to a new challenge.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with that. And unfortunately, as we have a rising energy crisis, the sort of focus might be more on energy efficiency as we go forward. I think that's sort of all we have time for. Does anyone have any final comments they want to make? Don't worry if you don't, but I just wanted to check. No, brilliant. No?
I think we've all got lots of things to do.
Yes. I've got a big task list here that I should look at. So yes, I think we'll conclude it there. For all the listeners and viewers, I hope that was sort of insightful. I definitely learned a lot. That was really good. Thank you. I want to thank you all, the speakers, for a very great session today. You know, it's really insightful, and thank you for your time and insight. I also want to thank you, the audience, for a very good session. Thank you for your participations and questions. We'll follow up with all members with an email containing a recording of today's session and the reports that we mentioned. We also have a net zero solution pack, which it says here, a link in the chat, and will be emailed to you. So that solution packs will help you get the information on the sort of first steps to sort of net zero. It's I believe available from now until the 8th of May. Was there another slide I need to read out, Dimple? Yes, there are more net zero webinars. So the 27th of April, we've got the role of innovation helping the built environment achieving net zero. And tomorrow we also have net zero in the food sector from 2 till 3:30. Again, I want to thank you, all speakers. Thank you for your time. Very much appreciated, and thank you for everyone that attended.
Okay. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.